Mackenzie M, and I researched the question, to what extent has the urbanization of developing regions in Asia facilitated a change in the Human Development Index in the last 50 years? Now, after my research, I came to the conclusion that the urbanization of developing regions in Asia increased the Human Development Index in the last 50 years and facilitated the growth of a better quality of life. Now, first, to understand this question, we need to understand what the Human Development Index is. And according to the United Nations, the Human Development Index is a measurement that includes 3 different areas. A long and healthy life, which includes life expectancy, knowledge, which means the mean years of schooling, and a decent standard of living, which means the GNI, the gross national income. However, it is important to note that many research studies will substitute gross national income with GDP or the just economic growth in general. Now, from the Civil Service College in Singapore, I found an estimated and projected urbanization of Southeast Asian countries. And from this we can see, if you even look at Singapore, which went from about 30 to even like 35 in the last 25 years, from this we can understand that already urbanization is happening. And from one of the stimulus materials that we had, the urban transformation of the developing world, that also supports this research and supports the idea that until 2050, this urbanization will continue to increase, especially in regions of Asia that are currently developing. Now, from PLOS ONE, a peer-reviewed scientific research journal, this is an annual growth rate and the urbanization speed of the world. And if we look at regions in Southeast Asia, for example, places like China and South Korea, we can see that the annual growth rate is very high, especially when compared to, say, for example, a developed region already like the United States. Now, keep in mind this graph. If you look at the economic growth, you can see that areas like China and South Korea and India all have very high economic growth rates, from about 6 to 11% growth rate already in China. But if you look at some places like developing regions, for the United States, it's a very slow increase. Now, this graph also explains the urbanization level, and this goes from 1980 to 2011, and it shows that the population in 1980, the population in those areas, most of the urbanization that was happening was in the 20 to 30 to 10 to 20%. And already we can see that the GDP, if we compare that to the GDP per capita from 1980 to 2011, we can see that the increase in GDP per capita and that we've increased the urbanization levels. And this is when I'm going to address one of the limitations of this, is that for some developing countries, while China may be the best example of a country that is developing extremely fast because of the manufacturing and industry that they have there, some other developing countries have had a stagnant growth rate where already if you compare them to developed regions right now, that would be where they were in 1970, and they've had a stagnant rate. However, it is important to know that even though they're stagnant, they have just had an economic growth rate. So overall, that is a good thing. Now, it's important to look at the average learning outcomes. Now, what I did is I focused first on the economic side of things because I found that the economic really impacted not only the health and the learning. So from this, we can see that the GDP per capita, the more that they spent on the GDP, the average learning outcome scores would increase. If you look at Singapore, for example, they spent a lot of their GDP on education, and that, of course, has a good outcome with better averages. And this is from the ourworldindata.org. We can also see a positive correlation between test scores and long economic growth. For example, if you look at China and Korea, you can see that, and that is really because in an urbanized area, this means you have more economic opportunity. So not only do you have proximity to more schools, but the facilities are usually better. You may have more technologies and more teachers. So what this means is that the learning that you will have will be much better than an education in a rural area, if there even was a school there. Now this is where you can see the connection between the health and then the learning outcomes, which also connects to the economic area. While this is a very busy graph, you can definitely see from developed all these regions, that there's a negative correlation. There's a negative correlation between average years of school and child mortality rate, which shows us that the more money that you have, the more years of education that you have, and the lower the child mortality rate is. And this from the Civil Service College in Singapore shows the child mortality rate in relation to urbanization. So to get specific with South Asian countries, you can see that, for example, Singapore, the Philippines, as you are having more percentage of urbanization, the child mortality rates are decreasing. And this is just one way in that the life expectancy is shown, because of course if you make that first leap and children are surviving, that is of course going to increase life expectancy. And now this is where I address the limitation. While it is proven that as you urbanize and become a more developed region, life expectancy does increase, this is where you're gonna have the fall of the developed regions. For example, overweight. So if you have low urban population, for example, only 19.6% of men will be overweight, but high urbanicity, 37.5%. And that's just a downfall of urbanization and development, because once you have that, then you won't have to worry about malnourishment, you have to worry about obesity, just because you have more money to have that option. Now this is kind of where I come to my conclusion, that overall, even if you just look at the Human Development Index, which was my research question, and the percent urban, you can definitely see how that there's a correlation between these two. And this graph is what in fact inspired me to have this topic and to really find the reasons why or how are we noticing these trends. Now from the second stimulus, looking for the Gulf Motel, this looks at some of the reasons why not, why should we not develop then if there's such great impacts of it. Well, for example, this person addresses their more emotional feelings, like I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach in my past. If you look at the emotional impact that some of these urbanized places have on maybe your memories or the life that you're having now, that can be something that maybe makes you not want to have that urbanization. And I didn't address it because it wasn't pertinent to the Human Development Index, but with our urbanization comes industrialization, and that will also bring some negative environmental impacts, like for example industrialization, which will bring carbon dioxide and sulfur into the air. However, that did not negatively impact humans' health enough for me to address it. And so after this research, I've come to the conclusion that the urbanization of developing regions in Asia increased the Human Development Index in the last 50 years and facilitated the growth of a better quality of life. Thank you. What questions do you have?
All right, I have two questions for you. First up, how valid and reliable were the sources that you used, and then how do you know?
My sources, I feel like, were very reliable because I use the United Nations. I also use ourworldindata.org, which is used by places like Harvard and Oxford, and it's the New York Times and many famous publishers also agree with that. And I use the Civil Service College in Singapore, which is their governmental facility. So I do trust many of the sources that I used.
All right, and next question. Explain the level of certainty you are about your conclusion.
I'm very certain about my conclusion because already from the get-go, I knew that the urbanization did increase the Human Development Index. My job was to find out exactly how did that happen, why did that happen, and I found out because of the better economic situation, which led to better schooling, better health facilities, more teachers, more medical practitioners, and things like that.